been 65 years of a struggle that has yet to find any resolve. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one that over the years has frequently been shaped by the role of the U.S. And since 1967, almost every president has made an attempt at brokering peace between the two countries. And now, 5 years into his presidency, Obama's attempting to do the same. Recently, his administration announced that Secretary of State John Kerry convinced Israeli and Palestinian authorities to sit back down at the negotiating table in hopes to work out a comprehensive peace agreement within 9 months. But with peace talks just days away, Israel might already be derailing them with the announcement of the construction of 1,200 new settlement units in the West Bank, a move that's likely to reinforce doubts over Israel's commitment to peace. So are these peace talks over before they've even begun? And given this country's close allegiance with Israel, will the U.S. be able to moderate them fairly? To talk about all that and more, I spoke earlier with Norman Finkelstein, activist, political scientist, and author of Knowing Too Much: Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. I first asked him why he thinks the Obama administration is finally attempting peace talks after 5 years. And here's what he had to say.
Most importantly, number one, the Arab world is shattered, it's fragmented since the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, and many of the Arab states, critical Arab states like Saudi Arabia, are willing to do basically whatever the United States tells them to do. Number two, after the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Hamas lost its principal ally, and Hamas has been the main obstacle to the Palestinian Authority and the main opposition to a sellout peace treaty. Number three, the Palestinian people themselves are despondent, despairing, depressed, and depoliticized now more than ever. And number four, the Palestinian Authority, which goes from one economic crisis to the next, is now more enthralled, more economically dependent on the United States than ever before. So given those four significant changes, there is the hope on the part of the Obama administration and Secretary of State Kerry in particular that they can ram down the Israeli terms of settlement. Obama will be able to claim some sort of achievement in his otherwise failed presidency, and Secretary of State Kerry can claim a significant achievement as well.
Right, and you've said that in the past, the similar initiatives for peace talks have happened at the height of the unpopularity in certain presidential cabinets. So that could also be the explanation of why the time is right now. Just days after announcing the start of peace talks, the Israeli government okayed the construction of 1,200 new settlements in Jerusalem and the West Bank. So, Norman, how can the peace process be taken seriously at all if Israel won't make a concession to halt building settlements?
I think because there's a lack of clarity on what the Israeli terms for resolving a conflict are. Israel has made clear over and over again that its bottom line is once approximately 9.5% of the West Bank, what it calls the main settlement blocks, including East Jerusalem. And most of the new settlements that they're right now planning to build are in the areas of these settlement blocks. If Israel gets its way and they annex the 9.5% of the West Bank, there won't remain anything of what you might call a meaningful Palestinian state. Those settlement blocks, they bisect and trisect the West Bank. They absorb some of the best, most arable soil in the West Bank. They absorb the critical water resources. They absorb the urban center of East Jerusalem, which is the hub of Palestinian economic life. The Greater Jerusalem Triangle, which goes from East Jerusalem to Ramallah to Bethlehem, it accounts for 40% of the economic life in the West Bank. So if and when Israel absorbs the urban center in East Jerusalem, there's nothing left. But those are their terms for resolving the conflict, to leave the Palestinians basically an Indian reservation, or in the terms of South Africa apartheid years, a Bantustan. And the hope now is on the part of the U.S. and Israel that they can impose that settlement on the Palestinians because the Palestinians are so weak.
Well, Israel has claimed that it's going to make a concession of releasing 100 Palestinian prisoners. I mean, how are Palestinians receiving that? Is that supposed to be good enough?
Well, the first announcement came today of the first 26 prisoners. Of those first 26 prisoners, a large number of them were in jail for, say, 20 years, and they were scheduled to be released a month from today. So this big prisoner release saved these prisoners about 1 month of 20 years in prison. That's literally the case if you go through the prisoners one by one. But let's even say, for argument's sake, these were authentic and genuine prisoner releases and not fictitious ones. The basic quid pro quo is Israel says to the Palestinians, we will give you 100 prisoners, and in exchange, we're taking 10% of your country. Then you have to decide for yourself, is that a fair exchange?
Good point. when you pose it that way, especially when they have thousands upon thousands of prisoners from Palestine for some really small level crimes here. Well, now that Palestine has been recognized as a non-member state by the UN, does that give them any more leverage at the negotiating table?
Well, the problem is you don't win anything at a negotiating table that you haven't won already in the battlefield. The battlefield can mean the battlefield of arms, or it could be the battlefield of public opinion. The only way the Palestinians will achieve anything is the way any other group in the world, any other nation, people, country has achieved anything, and that's by organizing its population to resist. I'm an atheist, I'm a resolute atheist, but I still believe strongly in the adage, God helps those who help themselves. You're not going to get anything from the Israelis, you're not going to get anything from the Americans unless you force them in order to extract concessions. And Israel, or I should say the Palestinians and the so-called Palestinian negotiators, they won't get anything from the negotiating table that they haven't won through mass action, mass resistance, and a mobilization and galvanization of international public opinion to force to extract concessions from Israel.
Right. I mean, so how can we expect it to be moderated fairly at all, especially given that Israel is the U.S.'s closest ally and receives $3 billion of aid every year? I mean, really, is anything going to be done that is beyond just superficial here?
Well, the Palestinians are only at the negotiating table because they were forced to be. The basic thing is Obama, as was clear at the time, Obama called up the Palestinian Authority and said, if you don't come to the negotiating table, we're not paying your bills. And in the absence of those U.S. subsidies, the Palestinian Authority knew that it would be liable to being overthrown because it survives by virtue of the monies it pays to the police, the public sector in Palestine. And so they went to the negotiating table because they were ordered to go there. The more interesting question, and I don't mean this facetiously, is exactly what are they going to talk about? Because the Palestinians know exactly what the Israeli terms for resolving the conflict are. The Palestinians know perfectly well what Israel's bottom line is, because as you pointed out, there have been negotiations and negotiations and negotiations in the past. We know exactly what Israel's bottom line is. We know exactly what the Palestinian bottom line is. So the really perplexing question in these so-called peace talks is what exactly are they going to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You just hit it on the head right there. And I wanted to talk about the perception of this issue, Norman, because I think that that's stifling a lot of understanding and a lot of consciousness around the world, especially here in America, in light of us sponsoring the Israeli government with our tax dollars. The language that's used to control the narrative. Your parents are Holocaust survivors, and you've actually said that the memory of the Holocaust is exploited as an ideological weapon. I was wondering if you could talk about what you meant by that and how that's deterring the understanding of this whole situation.
Well, the Nazi Holocaust has served as a double weapon has served as a critical weapon for the Israel in trying to justify what it does. Most importantly, Israel claims the Nazi Holocaust was unique, that no other suffering in the history of humankind has ever compared to what the Jews endured during World War II. And then it follows from that, according to the Israelis, because the suffering is unique, you can't apply to Israel and Jews. You can't apply to Israel and Jews the same moral, political, legal standards that you apply to any other people. And so, for example, even though Israel repeatedly commits gross human rights violations, Israel commits gross crimes under international law, including the building of the settlements, which is a war crime under the Rome statutes of the International Criminal Court. Whenever you try to call Israel to account for the human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity that it commits, what it immediately does is it invokes the Nazi Holocaust and says that you can't apply to us the same standards, the same moral standards, the same legal standards, because of what Jews endured during World War II, which was allegedly unique. And then the same thing comes up, for example, in current negotiations with Iran, when, for example, the new UN representative for the United States, when she was testifying before Congress, and she's talking about Israel's attitude towards Iran, she says, well, of course, you can't forget the Holocaust. Well, really? So you mean the Holocaust means that Israel is entitled to nuke, to decimate, to incinerate Iran? But that's the thinking. It's just an all-purpose utility item for Israel, the Nazi Holocaust, to be invoked at every critical juncture, whether to exonerate it of very real war crimes, crimes against humanity, violations of human rights, or whether it's used as a club in order to silence criticism of its relentless war-making, its relentless bellicosity, and its relentless desire to wage war on its neighbors.
It's quite unfortunate, Norman, because it really deters a logical, rational debate about this issue in the public discourse. I really appreciate you calling it out, speaking out. Author, activist Norman Finkelstein, really appreciate your time and your insight. Guys, if you like what you see so far, head to youtube.com/breakingtheset. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. I especially recommend everyone to check out my talk with Lance DeHaven Smith about when the term conspiracy theory became a tool to shut down any questioning. And that's it for us tonight. You guys have a great night. We'll see you right back here tomorrow to break the set all over again.